Hi, I'm Allison. I am a senior director and global head of Virtual First at Dropbox. I lead a few teams, one of which is our team, kind of big cross-functional team that advances our efforts towards the future of work, as well as our people analytics team and our people PMO team.
Hi, I'm Justine Glenn. I'm senior manager at Dropbox, reporting into Allison. And I primarily focus on our virtual first programs and managing the three different pillars of virtual first and our program managers that help make that come alive. And so that is our virtual first ways of working, our virtual first ways of connecting, and also our thought leadership.
So yeah, guys, so to kick this off, I started to think about what is the best way to better understand the Dropbox story? Because the Dropbox story is very, very different than the average pandemic-induced shift in working behavior. I can remember going back into the early days of the pandemic, hearing from, Shopify was a company that declared themselves their own version of virtual first and sort of said office centralization is over, right?
Mhm.
And you guys as a company also put sort of a stance down to say we are virtual first.
Mhm.
And what I think is really cool, and please help me understand it differently if it's different than what it looks like from the outside, is that you haven't really pulled back from that. Like what's been more common since COVID is to see companies flip-flop on their policies rather than stay the course. So that's just sort of like a way of framing what I'm about to say, which is that I think as a human, we all want to know what goes on behind closed doors, like what's happening in the White House or like what's happening around the dinner table of our favorite celebrity or whatever the case may be. So to kick it off, like what went on behind closed doors, so to speak, at Dropbox that caused you guys to make the shift that you made and stay the course?
And I love that you think this is exciting as what happens at the White House or with celebrities at dinner. So I'm just as energized and excited about it. But yeah, I think that's very much true. Like if anything, we've really doubled down, I think, in our, thinking and our model and our strategy because of the results that we've seen. And I think, yeah, prior to the pandemic hitting, we had already been kind of considering more flexibility and unlocking other talent pools, right? So that was something we had actually, already started looking at in the year or so prior to the pandemic. Then certainly when the pandemic hit, right, we accelerated that, like so many companies really accelerated that. And I think, um, you know, the thing about us at Dropbox too, when we really think about like our mission as a company is to design a more enlightened way of working, right? And so this was, an opportunity for us to really seize that because what we really saw was like we're never really going to go back to these kinds of traditional ways of working. And I think even from then, like even in the spring of 2020, we really saw it as a one-way door. And I think that's why we spent a lot of time really considering what our model should look like. Really, we're thoughtful about the change management and engaging folks across the organization, and then really spending a lot of time designing our model. And one of those things that we really did take, a close look at was, what were other companies doing? What were companies doing that were thriving, in remote work? What were companies doing that had gone remote and then reversed their policies? Like, what were the reasons that they did that? Because we wanted to kind of get ahead of that and think about designing our model in such a way that would kind of mitigate some of those risks, And so we actually started, it was like May of 2020. Personal context for me too, I was in a brand new role. I was leading our people strategy and operations at that point, and this was a strategic project. So it was a really exciting first project to get, and it's now evolved into kind of this really, incredible kind of undertaking. And so we started really as an HR-led effort, designing again, kind of taking many of those steps that, I just kind of talked about in terms of looking at external benchmarking, internal data, a whole variety of, different kinds of research as well. And then spent the next month or so getting executive team buy-in. And I think something that was really critical for us, and I think one of the reasons why we've been able to, double down and continue, stay the course with what we're doing, is because our CEO and co-founder, Drew Houston, is a huge proponent of the future of work and advancing modern work. And so he's been a huge advocate for our virtual first model since the very inception. And I think that's something that's really critical. Having that, executive buy-in, and especially from our CEO, has been really critical, and would be something I would, obviously recommend to other companies considering making big shifts like this. But then I would say another factor was the fact that we, it started as an HR effort, but very quickly became so much more than HR. And because I think when we got into actually designing more of the mechanics of our model, we realized, okay, yeah, we need to change our behaviors, but we also need to change the tools that we're using. We need to rethink our real estate approach and the spaces within which people are gathering. We need to, again, just really reinvent that kind of employee experience sort of end to end. And so we had about 100 folks on our Tiger team across the entire organization. That included, again, people team, comms team, our IT team, our real estate workplace services team, a number of folks in our engineering product design team. And then I would say maybe the third factor that was really critical for us too is we had our design team as partners right from the get-go, which was kind of a unique pairing. But when you think about it, like, designers really care about user experience, HR folks really care about employee experience. There's such a natural marriage between those two. And the design team and our design leader, Alistair, who's still our VP of design, really encouraged us to think about, like, this is a product, right? Like, we need to build virtual first like a product. And that's also been part of, I think, our ongoing success, because we said right out the gate to our employees, like, we're not going to get this right out the gate, but we want to all build this together. We want to hear from our customers. We want to build, we want to learn, we will iterate, rinse and repeat. And so that's also been something I think that, was really critical, taking that time. And that's something, since we announced in October 2020, and we kind of officially launched Virtual First in the spring of 2021. And that sort of open feedback loop has been something that's been, like, really consistent, that we've, taken to heart, that learning mindset in the last, 4 years.
Allison really captured that perfectly. And just, like, for some quick background, I was actually on the real estate and workplace services team at the time. I've been with Dropbox for almost 5 years now. And I joined Virtual First last May of 2023, because it very much evolved, and it was a very natural transition at that point. But I had that kind of opposite lens, where I was on the workplace services team, really responding to COVID and kind of going through the motions of what happened. And it was definitely a new approach from the workplace world, and something that very much steered from the traditional approach. But it was very exciting, very much was supportive of it, and really finding that new path in terms of how do we support our employees, how do we keep the employee experience alive, and just this entirely new world that was so exciting to dive into and really partner with all the different cross-functional partners that was working so closely on this, to make sure we did this right, and make sure we really turned over every stone, and really essentially supported our employees through the process.
Well, that's so cool that you were on the real estate and workplace side, and that you have this level of enthusiasm for an entirely new approach, which is ultimately less reliant on physical real estate. So we're jumping a bit ahead of where I wanted to go, but it feels like I should just tug on this. Like, what is it that makes you excited, Justine, about the role of the workplace in a world that you guys are calling virtual first? Like, how do you see that? And then I have numerous other follow-up questions, but let's go there first.
Yeah, I guess to me, and especially with Dropbox, we very much, when we were in office prior to the pandemic, our workplace and our offices very much embodied our culture and the tech culture more broadly. And so, of course, shifting away from the in-person in office experience, essentially, of course, is a bit jarring from a workplace manager, which I was at the time. However, it really opened this new world in terms of employee experience, because in tech, especially managing these large offices, very much captured the essence of the culture of the company. And so it was just a new way. We were always involved in the employee experience. We were always involved in the culture by managing these spaces and bringing our company to life through these spaces. So this was just a new way to do it, where we were doing it not only remotely, but we obviously didn't get rid of our offices altogether. We transformed them into our studios. And so it was also this new approach in terms of how do we optimize the experience that in a space that we're not necessarily going to every day from 9 to 5 like we were before, but we're actually coming together for very intentional, specific in-person gathering moments to collaborate, to innovate, and really how do we optimize our space to make it feel special and really be able to enable employees to also do what they came on site to do, and that feels worth that time away and commuting and everything else. And so it was really exciting to just look at it in a new lens in that aspect, but also really broaden the employee experience as well. And so that's when we introduced our neighborhood program. And really leaned into how do we still foster connection in a virtual world, which initially that was really challenging. And how do we do that and make people feel more connected? And so it was just so exciting. My entire team on the workplace team, everyone was very excited, and they were very excited for the opportunity to do something that not necessarily a lot of others have done before, and really to have that blank space and that blank canvas to really be creative, really to be innovative, and of course have really great cross-functional partners to help us along the way. So we very much did it, and it's very exciting.
And what is the neighborhood program in more specific terms?
Yeah, so in response as well to shifting into virtual first and really recognizing how do we continue with that connection piece. And so, of course, employees had the connection piece through their teams and who they worked with. And we had some great things in place of how do we approach teams in the virtual environment and make sure we're making time and space for that connection. But what about more broadly? And knowing that our studio spaces, people were really only coming together to collaborate, and we were kind of not necessarily having that organic, like stopping by the water cooler or getting a cup of coffee. How do we recreate that in the virtual world that's not just another Zoom happy hour? And so we introduced the neighborhood program. And essentially what that is, we have over 35 neighborhoods now, where we have at least 10 or more Dropboxers that are mapped within a city center where we have critical mass, which again, we have 35 across the globe now. And so we have this local cohort of employees. And so essentially everyone was placed in a neighborhood. And even if you live somewhere very remote, we still have a neighborhood for you, and it's called our Pocket Neighborhood Program. And essentially, it's this separate space outside of your team, outside of kind of the small group of people that you work with, and it's people who you live close to. And so we have access to on-demand co-working spaces. And so we frequently host co-working pop-ups where local team members just come in to co-work together and foster new connections. And then we also have space just for social connections as well. And even we do things such as all hand watch parties, and we've brought Hack Week to our neighborhoods and done pop-ups. We've done manager trainings, things like that. And so giving people the option to foster new connections that are local and also just be able to gather with and connect with over the company. And that's been really critical for us.
And I think, that was something that what Justine mentioned too around culture and our offices being a really like pre-pandemic, pre-virtual first, like these culture centers, right? Because they were phenomenal. They were these beautifully designed spaces. I mean, they were incredible. And that's really how they were viewed. We knew we'd have to be really redefining what culture looked like. Like it's not about the spaces, it's about the people. It's about our shared set of values and beliefs, right? Like and how we come together. And the space, you know, is important certainly, but it's not the culture and the center, right? And so it's about like kind of reframing that. And with the neighborhoods program, yeah, it's about the people coming together. It doesn't matter actually if you're on the same team. What you share is that you both work at Dropbox. You might be both managers in this particular area. You might, you know, be cross-functional partners at some point, but building out those kind of weak tie connections, right? With, again, another kind of common pitfall that we saw with remote work was, you know, people feel connected to their direct teams, but maybe less so as you get farther and farther out in the organization. And this was one way that we're really, you know, hoping to address that.
When I talk to people in your world, broadly speaking, the ones that are responsible or the custodians of the workplace experience, and I'm not actually now going to reference you guys, I'm just speaking generally here, they'll say things to me like, we can't get executive buy-in to use co-working space because our company is more focused on getting people to come back into our offices than we are to unbundle the office or distribute it everywhere else, right? So one is we can't get executive buy-in. The other end of the spectrum is we make it available, but our employees don't really want to use it. And so I'm so curious about both of these. I mean, I'm more curious about the second one because I that makes me feel like there might be like inertia where it's human nature to not want to leave the environment that you are comfortable in. But to me, especially for myself, like I work in a distributed team myself, I like to move around and change up my working environment to be around other people, etc. But I don't even have the option to be physically proximate to my team because it's just not possible, right? But I do notice that if I don't will myself to go and do those things, I'm probably not going to do them. So how do you see the evolution of this on-demand and co-working world growing over time? Because right now it's kind of happening around the edges. Like what do you think it becomes in 10 years' time?
You know, again, we have 3 studios. We have a studio in San Francisco. We have a studio in Seattle and one in Dublin, right? And Justine mentioned these are designed for collaboration. We do within Virtual First, right? We are working remotely, but we come together quarterly with our teams in person, and those often happen at those studios. And then people gather in person, as mentioned, with neighborhoods, more on an ad hoc basis, external events, things like that. But anyway, going back to kind of how we use the spaces, I think something that we saw was, you know, our teams were getting more and more distributed, and you know, we have less and less people in places like San Francisco and places like Seattle, right? And so we were hearing from our teams, like, we want to be able to meet with our teams in locations that might be a little bit more conducive to like where the entire team is. Like our Virtual First team, for example, like Justine and I are both based in the Bay Area, but we have 2 team members in Ireland. And then the rest of our team is kind of distributed all over North America, right? So it's not always the most conducive to kind of come out to you know, San Francisco, for example, for a meeting. So when we were looking at the on-demand spaces, we were like, we really want to meet our employees where they are. We want to optimize for gatherings, those quarterly gatherings in places that are going to be, again, more conducive to our distributed workforce. But then beyond that, right, our Virtual First model is really anchored in like flexibility and freedom. And we really try to think about that, like, across a lot of different spaces. So you just mentioned like you like to move around a lot, like when you're working. We definitely have some people who have a really amazing home office setup and like to work in their home office setup. We have other people who are more nomadic. And so being able to tap into an on-demand space when they're traveling and be able to work from there is really helpful. We also have people who might be living in cities where they have smaller spaces or they have roommates, right? And so being able to, you know, kind of get out and go work in a co-working space is great. And then we also have folks, again, who are looking for more of that connection, more of that co-working experience. And that's where, in a lot of our neighborhoods, they'll do like monthly pop-up days, or in some areas, they'll even have like every week that people are meeting up, right? It kind of just depends. And so I think part of that on-demand space evolution for us personally was about meeting employees where they were, hearing the demands from our employees in terms of like, we would love to see this. And so for us, it really checked the box, I guess, like in terms of a lot of different like employee needs that folks were looking for. And I think, if you're really listening to your employees, I do think that flexibility is like really now the perk that a lot of employees are looking for. And so I see on-demand spaces and the evolution towards that really kind of fitting within that, like where employee preferences are moving, right? And I think like there are some really amazing co-working space networks that are out there that I think are also really willing to work with companies and really reconsidering their business models too, which I think is really interesting. And so I see that becoming more and more popular as companies begin to experiment with like more flexible spaces. And certainly there's a lot of benefit on the company side too, because you're able to kind of meet the, stay flexible with changing employee demands as well, and changing employee distribution too. So.
Yeah, you guys, this is again why I go back to you being such an abnormal company in a really cool way. Given the size and scale of your organization, it's so uncommon to look at real estate in that way. And I think part of the reason, this is me in a personal view right now, why the co-working sector has not expanded at the rate that it was being predicted to expand pre-pandemic. It's twofold. One is landlords don't like co-working from a valuation perspective. It has an adverse impact on the value of their buildings, right? Because they're doing short-term rent. It's like rent by the day, rent by the week, rent by the month. It's hard to value that in the capital markets. So that's one structural issue. But I think the other is that most companies, and I want to actually, this is sort of, I want to be provocative here in this conversation for a minute and get your take on this. But most companies are very, very focused on getting people back in to these cultural shrines. And they may not be doing it for all the same benevolent reasons that you guys are on a fully choice-led basis. So this is where there's a question for maybe Justine to start. I think the interesting thing about companies like Dropbox, and there are a few others, whether they're Shopify or Atlassian or the others that have really made a massive shift, which are not plentiful. They almost sometimes get dubbed. I see this in comment sections on posts that I make where I'm supporting you guys, where someone will say like, oh yeah, of course, like Dropbox is promoting a virtual first approach to work. They're a software company that benefits directly from the shift, right? And they'll say the same about Atlassian and others. So what would you say to that? Because that's almost like when people say, yeah, of course, landlords and brokers want people back in the office. That's how they make money. Like, I know that there's way more nuance to it than that, but how would you respond to that? And I guess what I would ask you is like, as a follow-up, is why were you able to do it when other companies can't and or don't want to, like what? So I'll start with Justine on that.
Yeah. No, great question. I think like what it comes down to, and of course, yes, Dropbox, very much our product really can support anyone, no matter where you work or how you work, and that's the beauty of our product. But it comes down to me, the flexibility in the agency. And as Allison touched on previously, really our focus and our objective for Virtual First is really driven by how can we enable employees to do their best work, and taking in all those nuances in mind. And how do we also expand that talent pool as well that Allison also mentioned? And so really, again, we really believe as a company that flexibility and agency are just really what is the future of work. This is how employees can do their best work. And ultimately, if they're doing their best work in the way that fits best for their unique needs, whether they're a working parent or whatever it may be, they're also going to be happier as well. And if they're happier, then they're also going to want to stay with us and really, again, really just embrace the way that we work. And so ultimately, I think too, like we're very intentional about our approach. And so for us, like coming back to the office, like for a specific number of days or whatever it may be, it is not really mapping back to that flexibility and that agency that we feel is so important. And Drew has like a really great, our CEO and founder, Drew, had a really great comment that he made at our work in progress event. And he said, but if you trust people and treat them like adults, they'll behave like adults, and trust over surveillance. And so again, it's really working with our employees, hearing that feedback, understanding kind of the changing dynamic so that we really can support all the unique needs of all of our employees and ultimately really do our best work.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've touched on surveillance, which actually you're now bringing me into another part of the conversation I wanted to cover. So of late, and I recently saw an article come out about this, there's this new office culture emerging, and I'm putting quotes around it because I think it pervades both in-office and remote cultures, which is this environment where employees are out there justifying or showing their productivity to their employer, right? And so the one that's always existed is this like being social and buzzing around the office, being visible as a mechanism of like, hey, I'm here, I'm working, you know? But the one that I think is more new at scale is the virtual version of that, where people feel that they need to be on 24/7. They've literally got their green light on Slack on 24 hours a day. They're making themselves feel like a tiger is chasing them to respond to every Slack message that they receive, and on and on. So this is an issue that many companies are facing in very new and dynamic hybrid ways almost. Like how have you had to deal with those issues at Dropbox, or have they not pervaded your company? And if you have, how do you deal with them? What advice can you give?
Number one, I think part of us designing our model in the way that we did was to try to mitigate this upfront, right? So we work in a way where we say we are an asynchronous by default culture, right? So what are the ways in which we try to do that? We have implemented core collaboration hours, for example, by region, which is like a 4-hour synchronous time block that we have in, our 3 different major regions. When folks are available, not just for meetings, but also like synchronous Slack pings and things like that. And outside of that, right, we of course say people have to stay flexible to meet with folks like earlier or after, depending on what's going on or where your team might be located. But that very much is about also kind of coming back to this idea of like nonlinear work days and being able to really design your work week and your work day around that. So these are things that we kind of built into the model from the beginning. But I do think that and another thing too, I will say when we were initially designing the model, we thought about what are some of the key mindset shifts that we need to make. And one of them was around this notion of busyness to impact, right? And how do we think about doing that? But I think there's a number of different things. So do our employees like rate their productivity very high? Yes. I mean, and I will tell you my own experience, I've never been more productive personally than I have been in virtual first. But it does come with, you do have to self-manage. I think your schedule, you have to set norms. We always tell our employees, right, to do hard blocks on your calendars when you aren't available, for example. Set your Slack, status to say like, I'm out of office, or I'm here, or I'm located in this time zone, or something like that. And I do think we try to keep our finger on the pulse of like how folks are rating work-life balance and, overall employee health and things like that. But I do think that is certainly something that, is top of mind. I mean, there are definitely there are definitely, it's not like it's all sunshine and roses, right? Like all the time, no matter how you work. And I think part of what we try to do with our employees as well is to double down again in these resources and these tools. We have like it's almost everyone in our company is in our virtual first Slack channel, for example, and we'll like every couple of weeks post tips on things like how to work like calendar blocks or communication norms on Slack and things like that, because I think all of us care deeply, right, about the work that we're doing. People, are feeling very productive, but we almost need to, like, again, continually kind of train and remind people too on like the norms, virtual first ways of working, train our managers to make sure they're setting the right kinds of norms and team agreements to project leads as they're working cross-functionally. So I think what I would say it comes down to is just a lot of intentionality. When you work in this way, you have to be really intentional. And that also means like you do have to reset, because these are also work behaviors that are ingrained into us, like as a society for so many years too, right? So it does require like reminders on like, hey, some of these things might have crept back up. Let's, take another look at your calendar and remove meetings that you probably don't need to, right? So we do these kinds of things kind of continuously to help support our employees, but it's definitely top of mind for us.
The team that I manage, we were distributed from San Francisco to Ireland. So we definitely have some time zones that we have to take into account. And many teams also are structured very similar. And so it's, again, going back to kind of what are those foundational aspects of virtual first that we have set in place to make sure we have some common ground. And there is some consistency across the board, such as core collaboration hours, things like that. However, also, what can we do and come together as a team and identify, okay, knowing we have this 8-hour gap and knowing we have these collaborative projects, how do we set these norms and how do we define a rhythm that works specifically for our team and specifically for the cross-functional partners that we work with? That's also taking in mind, of course, the working hours of everyone. And making sure, again, we are prioritizing work-life balance, but we're finding a way to still get the work done across the globe. And for our team specifically, and a lot of teams, we're really working towards how do we actually take advantage of these time zone gaps and follow the sun and pass the baton and keep things flowing and in a way that, again, is really taking in mind everyone's unique needs, unique schedules, and but ultimately coming together and being able to effectively collaborate. So for me personally, I mean, I've never been more productive as well. And being a working parent, like having that flexibility in terms of designing a workday that works for me and my needs, but also being able to collaborate with people across the globe is amazing. So really important in terms of just how we come together as a team.
I want to give you guys a thought experiment. Let's pretend you've both been hired to lead the workplace experience at a large US bank who is predominantly at the moment office-centric, but they want to make the shift to some version of a flexible hybrid or even virtual first approach to just really be crazy. Like, what do you think, like if you were to kind of like get into an environment like that, what are the few important things that you would suggest doing immediately? Because I think we could probably all agree that would be a big cruise ship to turn in a new direction, right? And so this is like where I'm trying to think about how can Cadence be like a vehicle for other companies to learn how to maybe just even take a little bit of the spiciness of Dropbox here or there and apply it. That's where I'm going with this question or this thought experiment.
It's a super interesting question. I mean, I think like assuming that you're hired because someone is asking for it. Someone is asking.
Yeah, assume
for
good intentions. Yeah, good
yes.
intentions. They want to do it. It's not like, yeah, they want to do it.
Right. And I think that honestly, like I would kind of go back to one of the key things about like our own origin story with Virtual First is that like executive team buy-in, because you need those executive advocates and those sponsors, because some of these transitions are quite hard, right? And especially if you've got a very large organization and also an organization that is pretty rooted in more like traditional ways of working, right? There are going to be, you know, folks throughout the organization, managers, leaders, maybe who are in opposition, right, of that. And so having, you know, sponsorship at the most senior levels, I think is really important. And so I would say focusing on that, like getting that buy-in and that advocacy would be really important. But then I also would say too, it's also really helpful to kind of just really have an understanding of the current state. And so where are we from now in terms of sentiment too, and where are we trying to shift to? Because that will also help design the right kind of change management plan. I will tell you, like when we had initially designed our own virtual first model and had announced it in October, I think we thought, hey, as of January 2021, we are going to become virtual first. We're going to have core collaboration hours. We're going to be, you know, doing all of this. But I think what we found in the initial sentiment that we got from our employees and then doing an initial pilot was we actually needed a lot more time to ground people in some of the foundational pieces of what it meant to work in this way. And so that really kind of upended a bit our change management plan, which was helpful. And I think it gave us the time we needed to train like almost all of our employees on what core collaboration hours was as a concept, for example. So I think that understanding of the current state and where you're trying to move people from, we know where we're trying to move them to, but where are they now, like would help also design that sort of change management plan. And then honestly, again, one thing I would take forward is this notion of the experience as being a product and that you continuously are iterating on it. Because I think one thing that's been really powerful about working at Dropbox is like, I think, and I hope this is true, and I think we hear this from our employees, but they also are building our model with us. So they're invested and engaged. And so they're very open and transparent with their feedback. And we try to be equally open and transparent with our feedback with them, right? So I would also say embedding that is important from a change management perspective, and also just getting buy-in from employees and feeling like we're all advancing this kind of together. So those would be some of like the key things that I would personally do, but I don't know, Justine, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you answered that perfectly. But the only other thing I would add, and definitely coming, you know, with my background and workplace experience, I think the other piece is also understanding what is special and what is unique about the culture and about what we do as a company. And so making sure we really make sure that we're taking that into consideration. How do we translate that into a virtual space, which is where our neighborhood program came from, for instance. And so making sure we're taking in those really, really core values and principles, and making sure that that still is represented in this new dynamic.
The only top-down mandate should be inclusion.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I'm getting from this is like it needs
Really
like the change needs to come from top down, but instead of it being an order or a directive, it's like we're going to co-create a new path forward together. That's the mandate, you know?
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, and honestly, I love that framing of that. I think that's really great. Yeah, because I think and I will say something more broadly too, right? Like with this space is also, I think the people who, like all three of us who work in this space, we care deeply about obviously the work that we're doing, but also like advancing modern work just overall for the benefit of so much, because we're seeing the benefits of these things too, right? And there's almost like an inclusion element to that as well. Like we're all, in addition to kind of building it with your employees inside of an organization, there's also like this broader network too, right? Of people who deeply care about this topic and are, I don't know, trying to carry it forward. So I love that idea of like inclusion within the organization. I think that's really key. Yeah.
I might go write something on that. The top-down mandate is inclusion. Okay, I have two more areas I want to cover in our time together. The first one is I really like, I know a lot of people out there are interested in trying to figure out what does office utilization look like in the future. And I don't expect by asking you guys a question right now that we are going to get to the bottom of it in any granular way, but I'll frame it for you. So Atlassian is very similar to you guys. In fiscal year 2020, 14% of their hires were remote, and they call remote anything that's 2 hours or more from one of their office locations, right? And in fiscal year 2023, I believe the number is 57%. So they are hiring increasingly away from their corporate offices, which increasingly makes it less and less viable for people to go to the office. Now, that being said, something like 25%, give or take, of the people that live within commuting distance of one of their offices show up between 1 to 2 times a week organically, right? And so where I'm going with this is like, I don't hear a lot of companies that are performing well right now talk about the fact that as they make this shift to like studios or whatever their new version of having an office is, they're not hyper fixated, at least outwardly or vocally, about the performance of that space from a physical utilization perspective. Like, of course, they want to optimize it, and they want to keep costs as efficient as they can be. But it almost seems like it doesn't feel to me like the moment of like, we really need to cut this space and slash it and get it down to way less. So like, I guess to now ask a question, just trying to like lead into it. If Dropbox had no offices today, zero, no leases left to expire, et cetera, what do you, like, what in terms of like pre-pandemic to now, like how much general utilization, how much need for a leased office, like a 5 to 10 year leased space would the company have and how might it look at acquiring space as headcount might grow over time, right? Because I think the correlations between those things are now all out of whack. So I don't know if I'm being too convoluted in trying to pose that question, but where I'm trying to get to is like, if we had 150 square feet per person before the pandemic and utilization of around 65% or something like that, what becomes a new normal once this all shakes out? Like that's what I'm just trying to broadly understand.
I think we spent a lot of time, partnering with our real estate workplace services team around this, this topic and how we think about metrics and utilization metrics and how we think about what success looks like. And at the end of the day, right, like our goal is that our teams are gathering on a regular basis, on a quarterly basis, right? So that's what we care about, is that our teams are seeing each other every couple of months, to get together, to work, work on team cohesion, to solve hard problems, right? So at the end of the day, that's what we look at as success, right? Our teams meeting regularly, and what effect are those gatherings having on team effectiveness and team cohesion, right? So that's what we care about. And like at the end of the day, that's like our like overall like, North Star kind of like metric around that. Like you said, of course, we definitely care about cost efficiency and looking at our overall like operating budget and all of that. I think there are certainly a lot of benefits to having some of our own spaces, right? In terms of the experience that our teams can have on site, particularly when folks are gathering in very large groups, right? But we have done that also in other flexible spaces, right? And we've done large team gatherings and event spaces and hotels and things like that as well. And I think, if we had no real, like there was nothing, right? I think, it's really interesting because I definitely think leveraging the flexibility, and again, that flexibility and freedom sort of like guiding principle within I think we would be really looking at a lot of flexible spaces, right? And those could be lots of different things. Would be interesting to think about, would we want to keep a space, right? That was like an owned, space, if you will, like where we had all of that on-site support. Maybe, but I also think if it's 10, 15 years from now, I also am not sure how like technology will advance, and can you have a really, really great tech experience on the go, right? Like, with the, I don't know, kinds of on-site support, like those things I think could evolve and will evolve like over time. So I would maybe place a bet that it would be, just continuing to kind of hone in on the flexible kind of like on-demand spaces. But I think that the key part is we want to ensure great experience for our teams when they're gathering in person. And there's maybe still some work to do, right? Like in terms of, some of the flexible spaces. So I guess it just depends on the time frame, right? Like, and how things would have advanced in terms of, like I said, like, the technology on the go and to ensure kind of all of those experiences. But I don't know, Justine, how would
Yeah.
you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the technology piece definitely came to mind. We just had our own people team offsite last week in our San Francisco studio where well over 100 of us gathered. And there is something to be said to have these centralized hubs that are Dropbox space. And really, when you are having a sophisticated gathering such as that is very custom, you definitely having that direct access, to the right technology that you need with the right people on site available to you, is really critical. But as Allison mentioned, these gatherings are very much happening outside of our spaces as well, and there's trade-offs both ways. And having that flexibility and what's important to that team and what that team specifically needs is what's key. But having these hubs are of course great and only add value to the experience.
It's so funny how I asked you a question about like office utilization and whatever, and we just zoomed out and really talked more philosophically because that's ultimately what will drive the outcome.
Mhm.
And what I always think about is like offices are cultural shrines, and I think that can present both positively and negatively. The way that you guys are describing your use of studios is very much, I think, a positive representation of a cultural shrine for an organization. And we have them steeped in our human history, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
churches,
Mhm.
community centers, libraries,
Mhm.
whatever, you name it, right? And what I wonder, because you're already, I think, again, pulling the future forward a little bit by articulating that you don't necessarily define a cultural shrine as needing to be branded Dropbox. Like it could be in a communal space. And I'm so fascinated by how the next generations will perceive this and how much it might shift with them moving into the workforce because they've adopted sharing economies like at scale, right? Whether it's ride sharing, whether it's Uber, everything, the whole sharing economy is fully
Mhm.
embraced by younger folks and of course everybody, but they're kind of all in on it and they don't care about things like home ownership in the same way and yada, yada, yada. So, I mean, if you're right, I think what we're basically saying is that these cultural shrines, they don't go away. They almost maybe have more relevance, but a lot less usage. And so by having a lot less usage, companies will carry a lot less of it going forward, but that they'll still carry it on some level. Do we agree that that broadly makes sense?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And again, I think, um, the more that, like, as we've seen our own journey and the more that we gather, and again, the more that we have embraced more flexibility around spaces, right? I really do think we see like our culture and our community again is that it's about the people gathering. Obviously, the space matters because you want it to be able to serve the needs of like what purpose you're trying or like what outcome you're trying to achieve. Um, that said, it's like I do think there is that shift that happens, and the more that we do it, and again, the more that we see success from how we're working and how our employees feel in those moments, and how they feel like it's really creating this effectiveness and this cohesion with teams. Like, yeah, I see that like embrace of um, it's less about the place, it's more about the people. And so again, that's like where I do see that shift happening. And I think it will be really, really fascinating though to think about as folks like they're entering the workforce when they, again, that workforce shift will happen when those folks move into more management and leadership roles too. It will be so interesting to see how that shifts there.
Like previously when the traditional kind of office approach, that's kind of where you come in, where you feel connected and within those four walls. And I think over the last like 3 to 4 years, in terms of that transition to virtual first, we've been so intentional about creating that connection and broadening that it's not necessarily in person. That part's very important, and that part very much exists in terms of what we do as a company and how we gather. But it's also beyond that as well. And so we don't necessarily need that space for that connection per se. It's again going back to that flexibility where there's a lot of different opportunities to gather for different purposes and where they gather as well. And again, like creating that space that serves all those different needs for everyone.
I am just so flummoxed by what work could look like in a decade. And so I'll just say two things. Off camera, we were both, all of us were laughing about how my daughter said to me, she's like, Dad, I love you, but I don't want to be like you. And I'm like, why? She's like, because you work too much. And so that really, really blew my mind, because my experience of working too much was my dad never being home. You know what I mean? And she sees me home more often. Is like, I don't want to be you. And I thought that this would be like, you know, like her looking at me being like, this is how it should be. So I guess if we, and then there's the whole AI thing, right? Which, like, I'm such a lay person and don't even remotely understand what's going on in this space. And if you are in the same boat, feel free. If you're not, please enlighten me. But when I think of those two forces, like AI and its evolution right now, and these younger folks watching their parents do something completely different, right? And Annie Dean, Allison, who we were with in Portugal, she said that like her kids think she's such a badass, but that they too don't want to be like her. So like, what are we trying to design, you know, like 10 years from now? Just like pull out your crystal ball, give me anything that comes to your head. What would be a win for my daughter, Elle? She's 6 right now, 15 years from now when she's 21 and she's entering the workforce.
Wow. I mean, this is a profound question that I love. I mean, I do think there is something around, you know, honestly, with COVID and the pandemic happening, I do think that was such a big, like, almost paradigm shift for culture just in general. And I think it almost reset like what matters to you personally, you know, what are your values? And I do think there is, you know, a lot of I don't know, increasing sentiment too around like wanting to really live your life, have meaning, right? I mean, work is obviously very important. Obviously, it's amazing if you can tie your work to your values and to your own sense of meaning, right, too. That's not always the case. But I think there is, you know, a lot of, you see this with like with some generational shifts around like just in terms of, you know, the amount of hustle that you have to do to like get to the next level. I think there's a lot of people who are like, I don't know if I want to do that, you know, moving forward. And I think that's maybe like what your daughter was capturing at the age of 6 too, right? Like maybe I want to be better balanced, right, in my life. And so I think that's something that will be really interesting. You know, there's like a lot of, I think, you know, growing sentiment around like having better work-life balance and things like that. I do think enabling, you know, more flexibility again for employees to be able to design their schedule, design their weeks, design their days, I think will be something that will, you know, I think continue to be important, like have that agency over your life. What that work looks like, I think could be different. I certainly think you were talking about sort of a sharing economy before, and I do think there's, what will be really interesting is like with folks that will be joining the workforce in 15, 20 years, will that be much more around, I don't have actually one job that I do. I have a group of jobs. It's more of that gig economy that then becomes more widely accepted and more widely adopted by folks because I get to keep, I don't have to stay accountable to one person. I have like 6 different companies or projects that I'm working on, and I could see something like that, you know, continuing to grow. So even taking that flexibility one step further where you have like just a really flexible workforce overall. I don't know, that's something that I could see growing in popularity and interest for folks. And that's even more nonlinear and even more like I have ownership over my calendar, but I don't know. Those are some of my predictions. What about you, Justine?
Yeah, I think flexibility is like by far what comes to mind for me. I think that people crave that. People have been craving that for a long, long time before the pandemic. And as a working parent myself, and I know we talked about this off camera a bit, that was always such a challenge to try to balance those two worlds. And many of us have very large commutes, especially if you're in the Bay Area. And it can be really, really challenging. To feel like you can be successful in both places. And so for me personally with virtual first and having that flexibility, my kids are a little bit older than yours. So my daughter, who's almost 11 now, she remembers the pre-pandemic. She remembers when I did go to work Monday through Friday. And she made a joke to me the other day about how, remember when you were never home for dinner? We only had dinner with you on the weekend. And it wasn't because I was completely ignoring my family or anything. It's just that was the reality of commuting. And the second there was a car accident on the Bay Bridge, it was kind of game over on the commute. And so it was always this challenge. But on the flip side, my kids do see me work a lot. And that even though I would have been working, of course, if I was at the office, they're seeing that, or if they're home sick for the day, they're seeing me in back-to-back meetings or whatever it may be. But it's also, I think it's also giving them perspective too. And I know my kids are proud of me, and I know that they know I work hard. And so I think there's something to be said about that too. Not only having that flexibility to balance your personal life more, but also to give that exposure. And my kids actually ask me a lot of questions about work or something they overhear. And it's like a good teaching moment too. So I really embrace that piece of it. But yeah, I think more broadly, I think again, flexibility is really where the people in my own life, whether it is parents or someone younger or whoever they may be, flexibility is what people crave, and they want to be able to have that space to work in what's best for them. Everyone is different, and so being able to be trusted to kind of hone in on how they can design their workday and their approach is really, I think, where the future is.
Love it. I will close firstly by thanking you guys immensely for this conversation. I think many, many people and organizations will get benefit out of it. But one thing I'd love to leave us with, and we won't respond to it, but I think the biggest challenge of the times that we are in and that we are moving into is not really about our physical presence with the people that we care about. We can facilitate that so much better at home. We can physically be with the people that we are meant to be with way more often, and we can do it intentionally at work. But I think the big thing that we need to worry about, and the thing that might be memeable, like if we make fun of the boomers or whatever for whatever they've done, the next memeable thing could be that we were physically more present with the people that we care about, but we were emotionally unavailable. And I think that we need to be conscious of that
Yeah.
lack of emotional availability
Yeah.
with increased physical presence, right? Because you can take it for granted.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks,
Thank you
Jay.
so much. This was so fun.
Yeah, it was very fun. Always a pleasure chatting with you.